This episode is brought to you by MeUndies. Underwear drawers are like the Wild West. You never know what you're going to pull out or what shape it's in. So upgrade your collection with the buttery soft comfort of MeUndies. MeUndies' signature fabric is as soft as a warm hug from your favorite sweater. Plus, it's breathable and oh so comfy, making it ideal for all-day wear. Get 20% off your first order, plus free shipping at MeUndies.com/Spotify with code Spotify. That's MeUndies.com/Spotify, code Spotify.
This is Fortune's Wheel, a podcast history of the late Middle Ages, and I'm Jonathan. In an effort to keep this show going and one day be supported without ads, I'd like to invite everyone listening to become a supporting listener on Patreon. For as low as just $1 a month, you can enjoy listening to various standalone series, such as the 7-part series on Poland's 11th century, as well as complimentary series that seek to fill in the gaps with information that just didn't quite make it into the public show. We're currently enjoying a series called The Book of Alexius that has already shown the rise of Alexius Komnenos, and will be updated with the bits of his story that don't affect the main storyline of our public show. If you support what's happening here and want to hear more, please head over to Patreon and become a supporting listener. The link is in the show notes of this episode. Now, this episode is more of an addendum episode. I realized there were a few overlooked explanations that I felt were necessary to understanding why King Henry IV of Germany was doing what he was doing in Italy, and how it impacted Robert Guiscard's invasion of Eastern Rome. And make no mistake, what Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII, Countess Matilda, what they did in 1081 and beyond directly affected Guiscard's moves against Emperor Alexius I's empire. I hope to explain a few things in more detail in this episode that will shed light on how they all interacted in the coming events. This is episode 139, entitled Henry IV Wants More Than Some Kingdoms. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. I want to start this episode off with a quick correction to something I said a couple episodes ago. It had to do with the politics of King Henry IV of Germany and Tuscany, and if it had anything to do with Tuscany, then it had everything to do, that's right, with Countess Matilda. I had said previously that Henry IV had declared Matilda an official enemy of the German state, but this isn't exactly accurate. No actual proclamation was made with that in mind, nor was anything put in writing using those words. But see, this is where history is far more interesting than any textbook out there. See, in my estimation, Henry did something far, far more ruthless than naming outright Matilda an enemy of the state. Henry outright dismissed her. So up to that point, we're talking about 1081, Matilda and Henry were in a constant tug of war over the hearts and minds, and taxes, let's be honest, of the people across Tuscany, from Pisa to Florence, Canossa to Mantua, and Lucca to Piacenza. Due to Henry's near-constant pressure in the region, Matilda issued very few actual decrees throughout the 1080s, but she still exerted what power she could on her fellow Tuscans, who were still somewhat pretty loyal to her. Henry, on the other hand, assuming control of the entire Duchy of Tuscany, went on a decree-writing frenzy throughout this same decade. Now, the best way I know how to describe it involves something we see in our own world of news media and politics and social media. If you repeat the same lie enough times and for long enough, people begin to believe it. And if you keep telling that lie after it's become, quote unquote true, then those same people will begin to defend it. Matilda and Henry both seem to be repeating their thoughts about who controls Tuscany over and over and over again until no one really knew who the rightful leader of Tuscany was. It took Henry marching across the Alps at the head of an army, stopping by Ravenna, of course, to pick up his chosen pope, Clement III, pitching camp outside of Rome's walls and throwing a rager for the ages in sight of Pope Gregory VII, and then marching back north, stopping by every major population center in Tuscany, minus Pisa, in order to convince others who was really at the helm of Tuscany. While all of this was happening, if you remember, Matilda was holed up in her mountaintop fortress of Canossa. Super cozy and super safe, but super ineffective in the moment. Each place he stopped, he reinstated the lie that Matilda was not their leader. He was. And with a little negotiation, he convinced them all to swear their fealty to him and him alone. But he did sweeten the pot, though. For instance, Henry promised an end to the Lombard practice of albergeria, which was the practice of a nobleman having the right to demand of his subjects any and all room and board he and his retinue may demand. This speaks to the no quartering statement in the United States' Declaration of Independence, I might add. The king also declared no castle will be allowed to be constructed within a certain distance from a city's walls, which spoke to what we saw in southern Italy, when Guiscard deviously built castle after castle throughout Calabria within striking distance of any city he'd just promised to leave alone. And that rather lucrative route between Rome and Pavia, well, no royal taxes should be collected in the foreseeable future on that entire path. According to Michelle K. Spike in her book Tuscan Countess, he also included protections on the Serchio and Matrone rivers as well. Road-based trade and river trade were now both protected from taxation. One of the cities Henry stopped at was called Lucca, which was located roughly 12 miles northeast of Pisa. While there, he issued one of his many decrees. This one was quite interesting, though. It was interesting not in what it said, but in what it didn't say. He would repeat decrees in every city he stepped in or was near, and each decree would be quite similar to this one too. Spike writes, quote, "Only Henry could render a decision in a dispute in Lucca. He authorized no one except his son or his chancellor to act in his name." End quote. Only his son or chancellor could act in his name to settle disputes, render decisions and judgments, and all the other myriad things one relies on their leader to handle and adjudicate. Only his son and his chancellor had that ability. His son, his chancellor. Do you see where this is going? Matilda wasn't mentioned at all. He could have said her name. He could have declared her by name to not have any power there whatsoever, but he chose to not even mention her. And by doing so, Henry IV effectively wrote Matilda of Tuscany out of history, as far as he was concerned anyway. Had he named Matilda by name, he would have been, at some level, admitting to all that she had at one point had a legitimate claim to the duchy. But by naming her, he would have admitted that she had once been the one doing these things, but now she's not. But by omitting her from the records, he omitted any possible claims she had been hanging on to for decades. It was a special kind of deviousness, if I do say so myself. And it's one you really have to, it's not apparent, it's one you have to dig and kind of read between the lines to see what was really at play there. So in short, was Countess Matilda named an enemy of the state? Well, no, but she wasn't not named that either, while simultaneously being put directly in its crosshairs. In fact, something far worse, in my opinion. She wasn't even acknowledged. The noblewoman who had made a career out of defending her father's lands and assuming control over it, she was written out of history from the perspective of the German king, which, by the way, don't forget, was her own little cousin. This would be something monumentally devastating to not only Matilda, but to medieval noblewomen's rights. But Even Spike admits to a fear she'd had all along while researching this fascinating woman, a fear I kept actually asking myself reading up to this point in her book. They called Tuscany a duchy, but a duchy owned ultimately by whom? The King of Germany. If Germany kept the Duchy of Tuscany as its vassal state, then the King of Germany would have ultimate say in who runs the duchy, right? Like Spike, I questioned, if King Henry IV had such a beef with Matilda, then why hasn't he evicted her already and chosen someone new? Well, the answer lies in one thing Spike says, quote, Henry's omission would be glaring if Matilda had ruled Lucca on behalf of the king, but his silence confirmed what I had already suspected. Matilda never held any rights from the crown. End quote. That's right. For decades, Matilda held control over Tuscany, in her eyes, by right of being her father's only remaining heir, woman or not. However, and this is a huge however, in the eyes of the King of Germany, she was nothing more than a pesky usurper to the lordship of the duchy. She had no official rights all along. She only had a faint and ever-waning popularity among its people. Now, this is not a detail you won't want to forget concerning Matilda's role in Tuscany, by the way. This will play into her approach to every single thing going forward. And make no mistake, Matilda was very aware of Henry's decrees and what they said. Or, more specifically, what they didn't say. She was a woman scorned, but this was a situation she happened to be used to, right? So now the question is, how would she respond? Okay, well, I'm glad I was able to clear that up because it is very important going forward. This whole Matilda versus Henry thing isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Oh, right. Right when I think we cleared it up, have we forgotten who she gave her entire land holdings, her entire portfolio, all of her wealth, everything she owned? Did we forget who she already willed that to? Yeah. The Bishop of Rome owns Tuscany, technically. So, we're still left with the question. The tug of war is still happening. Who owns Tuscany by 1081? Matilda gave it to the Pope, and every Pope after her beloved Gregory, by the way. She gave it all away to support Rome. But if it was never hers, then does the Pope own Tuscany? I don't have an answer right now, but I promise you it's not going away anytime soon. So just put a pin in that. But as of 1081, that confusion right there that you're probably thinking about, that's what they had as well. So, beyond that, Henry now, emboldened, moved on from Lucca to Pisa, finally, in early July 1081. Now this is, if you remember, Guiscard is already gone. He's already across the Adriatic Sea and on his conquest of eastern Rome. Now, there's no indication that Henry intended to move on to Pisa, initially anyway, but we do find him there. Well, at least close to there. So far as we know, he never stepped foot inside the city, and for good reason. See, Pisa was one of the first on the Italian peninsula to gain for itself a notable sense of autonomy. In essence, one could, in 1081, see Pisa as a proto-commune. The Italian commune movement will kick into high gear at the turn of the 12th century, but for now, it was still a bit on the horizon. But Pisa had well established itself as a functioning polity all on its own, standing on the proud and formidable feet of its maritime juggernaut of a navy, as well as its extensive influence and trade networks across the Mediterranean and even north into, across the Alps into Europe proper. Pisa was at the time much like what we'd see Venice become pretty soon, though Venice would eclipse Pisa by far in the long run. Let's not kid ourselves here. Pisa could be considered so autonomous at this point that any mention of it being inside the Duchy of Tuscany was for mere tradition's sake. The respect emanating to Countess Matilda or even King Henry IV was hollow lip service at best. They technically didn't need either one of these two people. Pisa was doing all right in the late 11th century. To boot, they seem to have enjoyed having Countess Matilda as their lady in charge, though. In fact, they were overwhelmingly pro-Gregory VII. They had a bishop of Gregory's choosing in its cathedral, which a new one was being built at around this same time, which still stands today, the Pisa Cathedral. And they were staunchly adhering to the Pope's Gregorian reforms. So when Henry IV showed up outside Pisa, well, you can now see why he didn't want to step inside of Pisa. It wasn't exactly a friendly place to him. However, the Pisans weren't hostile either. They knew their place in Tuscany and in the wider German kingdom of Lombardy, and they knew they were on firm footing of their own. In their minds, Henry would have to be outside of his mind to think he could threaten Pisa with anything that might hurt them. It's a good thing Henry had no intention of doing so, indicated again by his choice to stay outside where it's safest. But he did meet with Pisan leaders, military, commercial, religious, political, all of them. And he made another decree outside of Pisa. This one made some concessions, such as royal protection offered to all wives and children of Pisan sailors. It's pretty nice. He offered them free use of the king's grazing lands nearby, as well as that tax-free use of the road between Pavia and Rome, that benefit mentioned back in Lucca. Pisa accepted these terms and formally recognized the German king's lordship over the city, which would assume that they also accepted its anti-Gregorian stance, as well as Gregory VII's rival to the papacy, Clement III. Well, this should show you how strong Pisa was at the time. Pisa accepted all the benefits and none of these changes, right? Meaning, Pisa kept its Gregory-installed bishop. Pisa kept its adherence to everything that came from Gregory VII's papacy, i.e. the Gregorian reforms as they would come to be called soon. And Pisa continued to work with and correspond with and do business with not only Gregory VII, but also his Norman vassals to the south. Oh, and they also still kept very friendly relations with their beloved Countess Matilda too, which they will be generously rewarded by her in the future for. But that's a story for later. Yeah, Pisa, who knew? Henry may have left thinking he just won over the Pisans. But when he left, it's in Pisa, it's as if that faraway king was never there. Pisa, again, did not need him. Another interesting event I overlooked already was what happened to Henry immediately after he left Pisa. So, on his return trip to Germany from Rome, he'd already been to Lucca and Pisa, as I just said, and heading back east toward his route back home, the road led him to the next largest city in Tuscany, though still nothing compared to what it would be in the future, which was Florence. He made it there by July 21st, 1081, and as he approached Florence, expecting what he'd had almost everywhere for a couple months already, he was expecting an open door. Well, instead, he found the doors not only shut, but barred. The Florentines were another pro-Gregory VII city and strong friend to Countess Matilda. Henry offered the same things to Florence as he did to both Lucca and Pisa, but the Florentines kept their walls tight, and they stayed tight and locked for 3 full weeks as the city deliberated how to answer. In the end, taking a page out of their beloved Countess's playbook, they outright refused the German king's offers and asked him to leave immediately. Spike writes, this move made Florence, quote-unquote, the only city in all of Italy that remained faithful to her, that is Matilda, throughout the entire 20-year conflict, end quote. The Tuscan son was too much for the king, though, rumor has it, and he left after he received their answer, without a fight. Florence stood its ground against an increasingly militant and proud king, And it won. Florence. And Countess Matilda was remembered as the inspiration for the entire move. Now, for the last point to make in this short addendum episode, I want to make a connection that I admittedly failed to fully establish on the podcast already, and it has to do with the very impetus for Henry IV's little vacay through beautiful Tuscany in 1081. He wasn't just looking for a vacation home in beautiful sunny Tuscany. No, he was there to lay some groundwork for a future endeavor, the thing he's had in mind since he first understood his role in the kingdom and in history, from the moment he realized the power his father wielded in Central Europe. Henry had opposed Pope Gregory VII on numerous occasions, and not all of those times it ended well for him. But through it all, he established a stout opposition to the ruling papal authority. In fact, in response, he even elevated the Bishop of Ravenna to the papacy. This would be the man we've already met. He came to be called Anti-Pope Clement III, though at the time, depending on who you asked, he was simply known as Pope Clement III. But when in early 1081 he decided to pay Rome a visit, he was there to chip away. This is Henry, by the way, I'm sorry. He was there to chip away at the power structure in order to realize his ultimate life goal. Henry intended to become emperor. There was, of course, in a very real sense, one obstacle to him just marching down to Rome and having Clement III crown him Holy Roman Emperor. And that obstacle? Her name was Matilda. Matilda of Mantua, Matilda of Canossa, Matilda of Tuscany, Countess Matilda. Regardless of what you call her and what she was called then, she was the reason Henry couldn't just become emperor. Period. See, in order for a German king to become Holy Roman Emperor, he would have to establish himself as King of the Germans, check, right? King of the Lombards, check, and King of the Italians. And here is where Henry was lacking. Matilda, having assumed control over her father's Duchy of Tuscany, she swung the support of the Italians away from Henry, en masse. When he took over, he simply did not have the Italian support. Therefore, he could not become emperor. To be crystal clear, Matilda was the one person standing in Henry's way of becoming Holy Roman Emperor. He had established himself as a Lord of Germany, the Lord of Lombardy, and due to his opposition to the rightfully elected Pope in Rome, he even elevated his own choice to the papacy in Clement III. I know I'm repeating myself, but it's all vital to understanding this situation. He controlled 3 of the 4 necessary elements to become Holy Roman Emperor. But in order to justify his role as emperor, it was absolutely 100% necessary to claim reign over the Italians. And you know what? Not just claim it, but to have that claim accepted. Until this happened, he would never, ever become emperor. And again, here is why I have been so impressed with Countess Matilda. She was the bulwark to Henry IV's usurpation of the imperial crown, and her steadfast support of Gregory VII was her sharpest weapon. And for good measure, can we just stop and remind ourselves that this went far beyond mere politics? Remember, Matilda was kidnapped along with her mother Beatrice decades earlier when she was just a little girl, and she was forced to live in Henry's own manor house. For years, she was a prisoner to the then Holy Roman Emperor Henry III, and for years, as she was entering womanhood, an already confusing and difficult time for any young girl, for years she was forced to endure her younger cousin, this very same King Henry IV, as he pestered and tormented her daily. Matilda was harboring some deep-seated resentment and bitterness toward her younger cousin during this entire situation, her whole life. Though chiefly in her mind, defending her beloved father's legacy and lands was primarily her aims in establishing her control over Tuscany. Make no mistake, her childhood with Henry IV couldn't have been far from her mind.
In a way, it ends where it begins.
Very insightful.
Thank you for sharing this Red Baron with us, Linda. It's so tasty, it makes me want to share something of my own. I didn't actually read the book.
Me neither.
I watched the movie last night.
I judged it by its cover.
I haven't read a book since middle school.
I'm secretly seeing 2 other book clubs.
And I can't even read.
I'm not really Gary. He just paid me to be here. Sharing Red Baron pizza can lead to more sharing.
Now, in early 1081, Henry knew that a show of force in Rome would go very, very far in helping to lay the foundations of his ultimate plans of becoming emperor, which is why he mobilized a German and Lombard force to travel through Tuscany and toward Rome. As we know, this isolated Matilda and Canossa even further. We know this whole line. She was forced to stand by helplessly while Henry marched through Tuscany, deposing any and all pro-Gregory VII bishops and abbots and priests. Most of them, as you know, made their way to Canossa for safety, which became the think tank for arguably the most important event of the entire Middle Ages, one of them, the Crusades. But I get a little ahead of myself there. While Matilda watched Henry's forces wreak havoc on her beloved Tuscany's spiritual equilibrium, Gregory VII was forced to endure Henry's Pentecost rager outside Rome's walls. Then, on Henry's return trip from Rome, having made the waves he had intended to make, slowly ebbing away at the Gregorian stranglehold on the Latin West, he stopped by the last few major population centers in Tuscany: Lucca, Pisa, Florence. These we outlined in the first half of this episode. But as he was on his way back home, he received a letter from a far-off emperor, one Alexius I Komnenos of Eastern Rome. If he wasn't already comfortably back home in Germany, then he was at least about ready to cross the Alps to get there when he received this particular appeal. This would be sometime after he left Florence in shame in mid to late August 1081. Now, this letter was an appeal to march on Rome. But he just marched on Rome. He even threw a party there. Bread, circuses, remember? But this letter came with a sincere appeal and some really great gifts from the other Roman emperor. Well, making friends with Alexius I may reap serious benefits in the future, especially if he was to become emperor himself, the other Roman emperor. The sincere appeal was to do whatever it took to draw the Norman war machine, namely its pilot, Robert Guiscard, away from Durazzo, to pull the man away from his invasion of Eastern Rome and back home to defend the Pope he swore to defend. Henry saw another opportunity, so he chose to mobilize in late September or early October, and once again, for the second time in a year, he made his way across the Alps, this time very aware of the mountain passes closing quite soon. Henry made it to Lombardy before the passes were snowed shut. In the meantime, as we've seen in the last 2 episodes, quite a bit went down in Durazzo while Henry was marching south. But with Durazzo under Norman control, Guiscard could finally respond to the increasingly frantic and panicked letters from Pope Gregory VII as Henry's army marched ever closer to Rome. And this is where we will pick up the next episode. I hope this addendum episode was helpful, though. Putting all of these various storylines together is just, it's infinitely entertaining, that's for sure, and it's interesting work. I love it. But it's also quite frustrating and confusing at times, and I want to thank you all for allowing me to clarify a few things before continuing. All I can do is hope I've cleared up a few things and not, muddied the waters anymore. So we will begin the next episode with, Durazzo under Norman control, Alexius just starting to put the pieces of his post-Durazzo shattered army back together, Henry IV inching ever closer to Rome's walls for the second time in a year, and Guiscard reluctantly, but dutifully, sailing back to defend Gregory VII. Or was it defend Apulia? I guess we'll find out on the next episode. Thanks again, everybody. Until next time.